Every Thursday at 6:17 p.m., the woman entered the store. Not 6:15, not 6:20, always 6:17. After a few weeks, nobody noticed. After a few months, people started recognizing her. After nearly a year, one cashier became convinced something wasn't right. Her name was Margaret. At least that was the name on the loyalty card she used every week. She looked to be in her late 60s, gray hair tied into a loose bun, old brown cardigan, same leather purse, same shopping list folded neatly in her hand. Every Thursday, every week. No exceptions, rain, snow, holidays, Margaret always came, and she always followed the exact same route through the store. Produce, dairy, red aisle, frozen foods, then aisle 7. Cookies. That was where things got strange, because Margaret never simply grabbed a package and left. She stood there, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 10, once nearly 20, just staring, reading labels, picking up boxes, putting them back, comparing packages, looking confused, then doing it all over again. The first few times, nobody cared. Customers do strange things. But after months of seeing it, people began to notice, especially Emily, 28 years old, cashier, single mother, worked evening shifts 4 days a week. Emily noticed patterns. It was one of the reasons her manager trusted her. And Margaret's pattern didn't make sense. Every Thursday, same aisle, same behavior. Sometimes leaving with cookies, sometimes leaving without them. One evening, Emily mentioned it during break. "You ever notice the older woman with the brown cardigan?" Her coworker glanced up from his phone. "What older woman?" "The one who stands in aisle 7 forever." The coworker shrugged. "Not really." Emily frowned. "She spends 20 minutes looking at cookies." "Maybe she likes cookies." Emily rolled her eyes. "You don't spend 20 minutes looking at cookies." "Depends on the cookies." Emily laughed despite herself, but the thought remained. Because something about Margaret felt wrong. Not dangerous, just unusual. The following Thursday, Emily paid closer attention. At 6:17 p.m., Margaret entered the store, right on schedule. At 6:42, she reached aisle 7. Emily watched from the register area. Margaret picked up a blue box, studied it, set it down, picked up another, then another. Then she pulled a small notebook from her purse. A notebook. In the cookie aisle. Emily narrowed her eyes. Margaret wrote something down, then looked back at the shelf, then wrote again. For nearly 10 minutes, customers came and went. Margaret stayed, writing, comparing, looking around. Finally, she selected one package, only one. She tucked it into her cart, then quickly looked over her shoulder. Emily noticed that part too. The glance, as though she didn't want anyone watching. The feeling in Emily's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. At 7:04 p.m., Margaret reached the register. Emily forced a smile. "Evening." Margaret smiled back. A tired smile. The kind people wear when they haven't slept enough. "Good evening." Emily began scanning the items. Milk, bread, soup, bananas, tea. Nothing unusual. Then the cookies. Margaret immediately reached for them. Not aggressively, just quickly, as though protecting them. Emily noticed. "So, these are your favorite?" Margaret hesitated, a fraction of a second, then smiled. "No." The answer surprised Emily. Most people would simply say yes. Margaret looked down at the package. "They're for someone else." Emily nodded. "Family?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Something like that?" "Something like that?" Who answered a simple question like that? Emily handed over the receipt. Margaret thanked her and left. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute, yet Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, after closing, she reviewed inventory reports in the office, mostly routine, until she noticed something. The cookie brand Margaret bought wasn't popular. In fact, it barely sold at all. Only one package every week, almost always on Thursday, almost always purchased by the same customer. Margaret. Emily stared at the screen, then remembered the notebook, the long pauses, the nervous glances, the way Margaret protected the package when it reached the register. A thought entered her mind. At first it felt ridiculous. Then it didn't. The next Thursday, Emily decided she was going to find out exactly what Margaret was doing in aisle 7. And before the night was over, she would see something that made her believe the old woman was stealing. The following Thursday, Emily arrived 20 minutes early. She told herself it was because she needed to organize receipts. That was only partly true. The real reason walked through the front doors at exactly 6:17 p.m. Margaret, right on time. Again. Emily checked the clock. 6:17, not 6:16, not 6:18. The same time as always. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. People were messy. Life was messy. Nobody was that predictable. Not for a year. Margaret grabbed a shopping cart and began her usual route through the store. Produce, dairy, bread, frozen foods. Then aisle 7. Emily waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then she quietly walked toward the security office. The store manager wasn't there. Only a wall of surveillance screens. She pulled up the camera overlooking aisle 7. There was Margaret, standing in front of the cookie shelf, exactly as expected. But this time Emily noticed details she had missed before. Margaret wasn't looking at every cookie, only a few specific brands, 3 to be exact. She would pick one up, read the label, check the expiration date, look at the ingredients, then put it back, again, and again, and again, almost like she was searching for something. Not shopping, searching. Emily zoomed in. Margaret opened her notebook. The same notebook, small, worn, filled with handwriting. She compared something on the page with the cookie boxes, then crossed something out. Emily frowned. What kind of grocery shopper kept records like that? A minute later, Margaret glanced around. Not casually, carefully, the kind of look people gave when they wanted to make sure nobody was watching. Emily sat up straighter. Then it happened. Margaret slipped something into her cardigan pocket. Quickly, so quickly Emily almost missed it. Her heart jumped. What was that? She rewound the footage, watched again. There, a movement, a small object, gone into the pocket. Emily felt a rush of adrenaline. Now she was paying attention. Margaret stood there another minute and then pushed her cart farther down the aisle. Emily switched cameras, following her. Margaret stopped near the end cap display, looked around once more, then reached into her pocket. She examined whatever she had taken, for only a second, then slipped it back inside. Emily stared at the screen. This was exactly how shoplifters behaved. Not all of them, but enough. The nervous glances, the concealed item, the strange routine, the repeated visits, the notebook. Suddenly all of it started fitting together, at least in Emily's mind. She returned to the sales floor, trying not to look obvious. Margaret was now heading toward checkout. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. Emily's suspicion only grew. People stealing rarely looked like criminals. Most looked ordinary. That was the whole point. When Margaret reached the register Emily smiled politely. Find everything you needed. Most of it. Margaret's answer sounded distracted. Emily began scanning items: milk, bread, soup, tea, bananas, and one package of cookies, the same brand as last week. Emily watched carefully. Margaret seemed tired, more tired than usual. Dark circles beneath her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands. Several times she glanced toward the exit, as if eager to leave, or nervous. Emily couldn't decide which. The total appeared on the screen. Margaret reached into her purse, then froze. For a moment she simply stared inside. Her expression changed, a flicker of panic. Gone almost immediately. But Emily saw it. What is it? Margaret forced a smile. Oh, she looked embarrassed. I thought I forgot my wallet. Emily laughed politely. It happens. Margaret nodded. More often than I'd like lately. The words lingered. More often than I'd like lately. Emily didn't know why, but something about that sentence felt sad. Margaret paid, collected her bags, and left, just like every Thursday. But this time Emily wasn't satisfied, because she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen on the cameras. That hidden object, that pocket, that nervous behavior. After her shift ended, she did something she normally never would have done. She reviewed the surveillance footage again, this time from previous weeks. 1 week, then another, then another. 3 months of Thursdays, and a pattern emerged. Every visit. Margaret spent time in aisle 7. Every visit. She wrote in the notebook. Every visit. She concealed something in her pocket. Every visit. She left with only one package of cookies. Emily felt a knot forming in her stomach. Because now, she wasn't merely suspicious. She was becoming convinced. The next morning she brought her concerns to her manager, a heavy-set man named Frank, who had worked retail for 30 years. Frank listened patiently, then rubbed his chin. You think she's stealing? Emily nodded. I don't know for sure. That's not what I asked. Emily hesitated, then answered honestly. Yes. Frank leaned back in his chair. How much merchandise is missing? Emily blinked. What? If she's stealing every week for a year, where's the missing inventory? Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. She hadn't thought about that. Frank continued. People don't steal one cookie at a time. I know. Do you? The question irritated her. Frank wasn't dismissing her. He was challenging her. There was a difference. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling. Something was happening, something they weren't seeing. Frank sighed. Tell you what, he stood up. If she's back next Thursday, we'll watch together. Emily nodded, relieved, because now it wasn't just her imagination. Next Thursday, they would finally get answers. And neither of them knew that the truth waiting in aisle 7 was far more heartbreaking than either had imagined. The following Thursday, Frank stood beside Emily in the security office. A paper cup of coffee rested in one hand. The surveillance monitor glowed in front of them, and right on schedule. At 6:17 p.m., Margaret entered the store. Frank glanced at the clock, then at Emily. Okay, he admitted it. That's a little weird. Emily folded her arms. That's what I've been saying. Margaret grabbed a cart, started her route. Produce, dairy, bread, frozen foods, exactly as before. Frank watched silently. The longer he watched, the less he spoke. By the time Margaret reached aisle 7, even he seemed interested. There, Emily pointed. The notebook. Margaret removed the small notebook and began writing. Frank leaned forward. "Can you zoom in?" Emily zoomed. The camera quality wasn't great, but they could see pages filled with notes, dates, numbers, words, crossed-out entries, almost like some kind of inventory log. Frank frowned. "That's unusual, right?" Then Margaret performed the familiar motion. A quick glance around, a hand reaching toward the shelf, something disappearing into her pocket. Emily immediately pointed. "There!" Frank's eyes narrowed. He replayed the footage, once, twice, 3 times. The movement was obvious, yet somehow they still couldn't see what she'd taken. Frank leaned back. "Okay." Emily waited. "What do you think?" Frank didn't answer immediately. That worried her. Finally he spoke. "I think we need more information." Emily groaned. "You always say that, because most problems need it. But she's hiding something." Frank nodded. Maybe. Maybe. That word again. Emily was beginning to hate maybe. 40 minutes later, Margaret checked out. Same groceries, same cookie package, same tired smile. Then she pushed her cart toward the parking lot. Frank stood. "Come on." Emily blinked. "Where?" "Outside." For the first time, Frank sounded curious. The two of them walked to the front entrance. Not close enough to be obvious, just close enough to observe. Outside, evening sunlight painted the parking lot gold. Customers loaded groceries. Shopping carts rattled. Cars came and went. Margaret reached an older silver sedan, parked near the far edge of the lot. She opened the trunk, placed her groceries inside, then stopped. Instead of getting into the car, she sat down, right there on the bumper. Motionless for nearly 5 minutes, Emily exchanged a look with Frank. "What's she doing?" Frank shook his head. "No idea." Margaret wasn't checking her phone, wasn't eating, wasn't reading. She simply sat there, looking exhausted, as though she had just finished something difficult. Eventually she opened her purse, removed the notebook, and stared at it. Not writing, just staring. Then she wiped her eyes. Emily froze. Was she crying? Frank didn't answer, because he had seen it too. Margaret quickly closed the notebook, looked around, and drove away. The entire thing lasted less than a minute, yet Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. That night she lay awake in bed, her 7-year-old daughter Lily, asleep in the next room. The image kept replaying. Margaret sitting alone in the parking lot, staring at the notebook, wiping away tears. It didn't fit. None of it fit. Shoplifters didn't usually cry in parking lots. The following week, things became even stranger. Thursday, 6:17 p.m. Margaret entered the store, but this time she wasn't alone. An older man walked beside her, tall, thin. Late 70s perhaps. Gray jacket, gray hair, slow steps. Emily had never seen him before. The man's eyes wandered constantly, not looking at products, not looking at signs, just wandering, as though nothing around him felt familiar. Margaret stayed close, very close, one hand lightly touching his arm, guiding him, protecting him. The couple moved slowly through the store, much slower than usual. Several times the man stopped walking altogether. Each time Margaret patiently waited, never rushed him, never showed frustration, just waited. Eventually they reached aisle 7, the cookie aisle, and something happened that made Emily forget all about shoplifting. The old man suddenly smiled, a genuine smile, the first one Emily had seen all evening. He pointed toward a blue box on the shelf. His face brightened immediately, like a child recognizing a favorite toy. Margaret's entire expression changed. Hope, relief, happiness, all at once. She quickly reached for the box. Do you remember these? The old man stared at it for several seconds, then slowly nodded. Oh, those. His voice was soft, almost uncertain. Butterscotch? Margaret's eyes immediately filled with tears. She turned away before he could notice. Emily watched from the end of the aisle, completely confused, because something important had just happened, something deeply important, and she had absolutely no idea what it meant. Then the old man looked directly at Margaret. His smile faded. A cloud seemed to pass across his face. "Excuse me." Margaret looked up. "Yes?" The man hesitated, then quietly asked, "I'm sorry." His voice trembled. "Do I know you?" The world seemed to stop. Even from 30 feet away, Emily felt the question hit like a punch. Margaret didn't answer immediately. For a second, she simply stood there holding the cookie box, trying to smile, trying not to break. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." The old man looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." Margaret nodded gently. "It's okay." But it clearly wasn't okay. The man smiled apologetically, then turned back toward the shelf, and a moment later, he seemed to forget the conversation had happened at all. Emily stood frozen, because suddenly, for the first time, she wasn't wondering whether Margaret was stealing. She was wondering who that man was, and why the look on Margaret's face felt so heartbreakingly familiar. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the question. "Do I know you?" It followed her home that night. It followed her while she made dinner. It followed her while she helped Lily with homework. And it followed her long after the apartment had gone quiet, because she couldn't get Margaret's face out of her head. That tiny pause before answering, the effort it took to smile, the way she had looked down at the cookie box, as if it were the only thing holding her together. Emily had seen customers cry before. People cried in grocery stores more often than anyone realized. Bad news on the phone, financial problems, family emergencies. Life happened. But what she had seen in aisle 7 felt different. It wasn't sudden pain. It was practiced pain, the kind someone had been carrying for a very long time. The next Thursday arrived, 6:17 p.m. Margaret entered the store alone. No husband this time. No smile either. Just exhaustion. The kind that settled deep into a person's bones. Emily watched her move through the aisles. Something had changed. The old suspicion was gone. Now she simply felt curious, and maybe a little worried. At 6:41, Margaret reached aisle 7. Emily walked over, not as a cashier, as a person. Margaret was studying cookie labels again, notebook open, pen in hand, crossing things out, writing notes, the familiar routine. Emily stopped beside her. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret looked up, a little surprised. "Of course." Emily pointed toward the notebook. "I've been wondering about that for months." Margaret glanced down, then laughed softly, a tired laugh. "You noticed? Everyone notices. That's unfortunate." Emily smiled. "It makes people curious." Margaret closed the notebook. For a moment it looked like she might answer. Then she changed her mind. "Some things are hard to explain." Emily nodded. Fair enough. But before she could speak again, Margaret unexpectedly asked, "Do you have children?" The question caught her off guard. "One daughter." Margaret smiled. "How old?" 7. The older woman's eyes softened immediately. "That's a wonderful age." Emily found herself smiling. "Most days." Margaret laughed, a genuine laugh this time. The first one Emily had heard. Then the laughter disappeared, as quickly as it had arrived. Margaret looked back toward the shelf, her eyes lingering on a particular blue box. Butterscotch cookies? Emily recognized the brand immediately. The same one. Every week. Always the same. Finally, she asked, "Is it for your husband?" Margaret froze. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for Emily to know she had guessed correctly. Several seconds passed. Then Margaret nodded. Yes. Emily hesitated. Does he like them? A sad smile appeared. He used to. Used to. Not likes. Used to. Emily felt something twist in her chest. Margaret carefully picked up one box from the shelf, then another, comparing them, reading every detail. Ingredients, manufacturing dates, expiration dates. Every line mattered. Emily finally asked the question that had been bothering her for weeks. Why do you check every box? Margaret stared at the package in her hands. For a long moment she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. So, I don't waste one. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Margaret looked down. Her fingers gently brushed the cardboard, almost affectionately. As strange as this sounds, she swallowed. Sometimes they're the only thing he remembers. Emily said nothing. Margaret continued. When we met, he was 19. A faint smile touched her face. He worked at a gas station. Every Friday night he'd buy these cookies. She held up the blue box, the exact same brand. Emily listened. The noise of the grocery store seemed to fade away. We couldn't afford restaurants. Margaret smiled. So we'd sit in his truck. He'd bring cookies. I'd bring coffee. And we'd watch the sunset. For a second she looked decades younger. Not old, not tired, just in love. Then reality returned. The smile faded. My husband has Alzheimer's. The words landed softly, yet somehow felt heavy enough to crush the entire aisle. Emily already knew, at least partly, but hearing it aloud was different. Margaret continued. Most days he doesn't remember what year it is. Emily lowered her eyes. Sometimes he thinks he's 25. Sometimes he thinks his parents are still alive. She smiled sadly. Sometimes he thinks I'm a nurse. The silence stretched. Customers passed by. Shopping carts rolled past. Life continued. Yet neither woman moved. Then Margaret said something Emily would never forget. Last month, he forgot our daughter's name. Her voice cracked, just slightly, but he still recognized these cookies. She held up the blue box, as if it were something fragile, something precious. Can you imagine that? Emily couldn't answer. Because she could. And that was the problem. Margaret took a slow breath, then opened her notebook. For the first time, she turned it toward Emily. The pages were filled with notes, dates, locations, store names, inventory counts, different handwriting colors, tiny observations, months and months of records. Emily stared, confused. What is this? Margaret smiled weakly. My search. Search? Margaret nodded. The company stopped making them. Emily felt her stomach drop. She looked at the shelf, then back at the notebook. Suddenly everything started making sense. The notebook, the repeated visits, the comparisons, the parking lot tears, everything. Margaret tapped the page. I've been trying to find every remaining box I can. Emily slowly looked up, and for the first time, she realized she had been completely wrong about the old woman. But she still hadn't discovered the most heartbreaking part of the story, because Margaret hadn't yet told her what happened every time the cookies finally ran out. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The store continued around them. A child begged for candy 3 aisles away. A shopping cart squeaked somewhere near produce. The checkout scanners beeped in the distance, yet aisle 7 felt strangely separate from all of it. Margaret carefully closed the notebook, then placed her hand on top of it, almost protectively. Emily looked at the worn cover. "How long have you been searching?" Margaret smiled faintly. 8 months. Emily blinked. 8 months. Margaret nodded. The manufacturer stopped producing them last spring. She glanced at the shelf. There used to be dozens of stores that carried them. Now, there are only a few. Emily suddenly understood the notebook. Every store, every inventory count, every location, every remaining box. Margaret wasn't shopping. She was tracking, like someone trying to save something that was slowly disappearing, because that's exactly what she was doing. Emily looked down at the blue package. "How many do you have left?" Margaret's smile vanished. "Not enough." The answer came instantly, as though she'd already done the math 1,000 times. Maybe she had. For several seconds she simply stared at the cookies. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. A soft laugh, almost embarrassed. "You know what's funny?" Emily shook her head. Margaret looked at the package. 20 years ago, I spent half my life trying to get him to eat healthier. Emily smiled. "I think every wife does that." "Exactly." Margaret nodded. "I used to hide these from him." She tapped the box gently. "He loved them. Too much." For the first time since the conversation began, genuine warmth returned to her face. Not sadness, not grief. Memory. And memory looked beautiful on her. "He'd buy 2 boxes every Friday." Emily smiled. "2? Oh, yes." Margaret laughed. "He claimed one was for me." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And was it?" "Absolutely not." They both laughed. Then Margaret's eyes drifted somewhere far away. Back 40 years. Back before hospitals. Before medications. Before neurologists. Back when life felt endless. "He proposed with cookie crumbs on his shirt." Emily laughed again. "No." "Yes." Margaret nodded. "We were sitting in his truck. The same truck where we'd eat these. He got nervous. He dropped the box. And then he proposed." Emily shook her head. "That's actually kind of adorable." Margaret smiled. "He was adorable." The word slipped out naturally. Present tense, not was, is. Because love doesn't always follow grammar. For a while they simply stood together. Then Emily asked quietly, "When was he diagnosed?" Margaret's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The warmth remained, but pain returned beside it. 6 years ago." Emily lowered her eyes. Margaret continued. "At first, it was small things. Forgotten appointments, misplaced keys, repeated stories. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening. At least, not yet. Then one day he drove to work and couldn't remember how to get home." Emily felt a chill run through her body. Margaret stared at the floor. "He called me crying." The words came slowly now. "He was only 10 minutes from our house." But he didn't know where he was. For the first time, her voice began to shake. Only slightly, but enough. Emily stayed silent. Sometimes silence was kinder than sympathy. Margaret swallowed. After that, things moved quickly. She looked toward the front windows. The evening sun was fading. The store lights seemed harsher now. Colder. He forgot birthdays. He forgot vacations. He forgot neighbors. A pause, then. He forgot our anniversary. Another pause. Longer. Then, he forgot our daughter. Emily closed her eyes briefly. because there wasn't a parent alive who couldn't imagine how much that hurt. But Margaret wasn't finished. The hardest part was still coming. "He forgot me 3 years ago." The sentence arrived quietly, almost gently, which somehow made it devastating. Emily stared at her. Margaret gave a sad smile. The first time lasted about 10 minutes. He woke up from a nap, looked at me, and asked if I worked for the hospital. Emily's chest tightened. Margaret laughed softly, not because it was funny, because sometimes laughing is the only alternative. I remember standing there thinking. She stopped, trying to find the words. Finally, she whispered, "I've been married to this man for 38 years. Her eyes glistened, and suddenly, I was a stranger. Neither woman spoke. The silence stretched, heavy, honest, human. Then Margaret reached for the cookie box, again. Always the cookies. Emily noticed that. Whenever the conversation became painful, her hand found the box, as if it anchored her, as if it anchored both of them. Margaret smiled sadly. "The strange thing is," she looked at the package, "he still remembers these." Emily nodded. "You said that." Margaret's eyes softened. "No." She shook her head. "You don't understand." Her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "The cookies don't just remind him of the past." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret looked away, toward nothing, toward everything. Then she said, "Sometimes they're the only reason he remembers me." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. Margaret continued before she could respond. "Not every day, not even most days. But sometimes," her voice broke, "sometimes he'll take a bite, and suddenly he'll smile." A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "Then he'll look at me and say..." She stopped, unable to continue. Emily already felt tears gathering in her own eyes. Margaret finally forced the words out. "Margaret." A fragile smile appeared. "He says my name." Another tear followed. Just for a few minutes. She looked down at the box, holding it carefully, like it contained something irreplaceable, because perhaps it did. Then she whispered, "For a few minutes, my husband comes back." And in that moment, Emily finally understood. Margaret wasn't searching for cookies. She was searching for time, for memories, for moments, for tiny pieces of the man she loved. And every week there were fewer boxes left on the shelves, which meant every week there were fewer chances left. Fewer chances to hear her own name, spoken by the man who once knew it better than anyone else. Then Margaret looked at the notebook and quietly said, "I only found 3 boxes this week." Emily felt her stomach sink, because she suddenly understood what that meant. The search was almost over, and Margaret was terrified of what would happen when the last box was gone. The next Thursday, Emily arrived at work carrying a notebook of her own. Not because she planned to monitor Margaret. Not anymore. This time, she planned to help her. Over the previous week, she had called 6 grocery stores, 2 pharmacies, 3 discount markets, and 1 small specialty food shop 30 miles away. Every conversation ended the same way. "No, we don't carry that anymore." Or worse, "We sold the last box months ago." Each answer felt strangely personal, as though the world was quietly erasing something important, something Margaret wasn't ready to lose. At 6:17 p.m., Margaret entered the store. The familiar cardigan, the familiar purse, the familiar exhaustion. But today, Emily met her in aisle 7, already waiting. Margaret looked surprised. "What are you doing here?" Emily smiled, then handed her a folded piece of paper. Margaret opened it. Store names, addresses, phone numbers, inventory notes, every place Emily had managed to find. For several seconds, Margaret simply stared, unable to speak. Then she looked up. "You did this?" Emily nodded. "You've been searching alone long enough." Margaret's eyes immediately filled. Not dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that appear when someone unexpectedly shares your burden. "Thank you." The words barely escaped her lips. Emily shrugged. "Don't thank me yet." She pointed at the list. "We still have work to do." For the first time in weeks, Margaret laughed. A real laugh. And somehow that felt like a victory. The search began. Not officially. Not as some grand campaign. Just people helping. One person at a time. Emily told a coworker. The coworker told another. Soon half the store knew. Then customers started hearing about it. A retired truck driver checked stores during his deliveries. A college student searched online inventories. An elderly customer called friends in neighboring towns. Nobody was asked. Nobody was pressured. People simply wanted to help. Because once they learned the story, it became impossible not to care. For 2 months, the notebook kept growing. New locations, new discoveries, new boxes. Some weeks they found 6, some weeks 10. Once they found an entire unopened case in a forgotten stockroom. Margaret cried in the parking lot after that one. Happy tears, the rarest kind. But Alzheimer's doesn't pause for miracles. While the cookie supply lasted longer than expected, Richard continued slipping away. Slowly. Then suddenly, one Thursday evening, Margaret arrived alone again. Emily noticed immediately. Something was wrong, very wrong. Margaret looked thinner, more tired, more fragile. The kind of tired sleep can't fix. She reached aisle 7, but this time she didn't open her notebook. She simply stood there, staring at the shelf. Emily approached carefully. "How's Richard?" Margaret didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded older. "He had a difficult week." Emily felt her stomach tighten. Margaret nodded toward the floor. "He didn't recognize the house." Emily closed her eyes. "Oh." Margaret gave a small smile. "We've lived there 34 years." The sentence said everything. No further explanation needed. Then she quietly added, "He tried to leave." Emily's heart sank. For several moments neither woman spoke. Finally Emily asked, "Did the cookies help?" Margaret smiled. A sad smile. The kind that carried both hope and grief. "Less than before." The answer hung heavily between them, because both women understood what it meant. The windows were becoming shorter. The moments were becoming rarer. Then Margaret reached into her purse, pulled out a photograph. She handed it to Emily. The picture was old, edges worn, colors faded. A young couple sat on the hood of a pickup truck. The man held a blue cookie box. The woman held 2 paper coffee cups. Both were laughing. The kind of laughter that comes before life, teaches you how precious it is. Emily smiled. "That's you?" Margaret nodded. "And Richard." Emily studied the photo. Young Richard looked confident, strong, alive with possibility. Nothing like the frail man she'd seen in the store. Margaret stared at the picture. "I keep wondering where he went." The words were barely audible. Emily looked up. Margaret continued, "I know he's still here." She pressed a hand against her chest. "I know that." Another pause. "But some days," her voice cracked, "some days it feels like I'm grieving someone who's still alive." Emily felt tears gathering immediately, because there was no answer to that. No advice, no solution, only truth. And truth can be heartbreaking. 3 weeks later, Emily received a call during her shift. It was Margaret, for the first time ever. Her voice sounded different, shaky, breathless, excited. "Emily? Margaret? He's back." Emily froze. "What?" Margaret laughed through tears. "Just for a little while." Emily immediately understood. A window. One of those rare windows. Margaret continued. "He remembered everything." Emily's eyes widened. "Everything?" Margaret was crying openly now. "He remembered our wedding. He remembered our daughter. He remembered the truck, the coffee, the cookies." Every sentence sounded like a miracle. Then Margaret said something that made Emily stop breathing. "He remembered me." Silence. Pure silence. Then a whisper. "He called me beautiful." Emily covered her mouth, because suddenly she was crying too. Margaret laughed softly. "I haven't heard that in years." Then her voice grew quieter. "He asked me where all the time went." Emily couldn't answer. Nobody could. Because that's the question every life eventually asks. After a moment, Margaret said, "Thank you." Emily shook her head instinctively. Thus Margaret couldn't see it. "For what?" "For helping me find more time." And then she hung up. Emily stood motionless behind the register, unable to speak, unable to move, because for the first time she truly understood. The cookies had never been the point. They were only the bridge, the fragile bridge between memory and forgetting, between yesterday and tomorrow, between losing someone and getting them back for just a little while. But neither Emily nor Margaret knew that only one box remained unopened, and that the final box would arrive sooner than either of them was ready for. To be continued. The last box sat on Margaret's kitchen counter for 11 days, unopened, untouched, waiting. Every morning she looked at it. Every evening she looked at it again. And every day she told herself the same thing. Not yet. Because once it was opened, there would be no more. Richard's condition worsened throughout the winter. Some days he barely spoke. Some days he wandered through the house, looking for people who had been gone for decades. Once he spent 20 minutes searching for his father, a man who had died 23 years earlier. Margaret helped him search, room by room, closet by closet, because correcting him only caused pain. And pain was something she tried to ration carefully now. There was already enough of it. One evening Richard stopped in the hallway, confused, lost, standing in the very home he had built. He looked at Margaret and asked, "Can you help me get home?" Margaret felt her heart break. Again. The strange thing about heartbreak was that it never seemed to run out. You could survive it 1,000 times and still feel it the 1,001st. She smiled gently. "You're already home." Richard looked around uncertainly, then nodded, as if choosing to trust her, even if he no longer knew why. The final box remained unopened. 3 days later, Margaret received a phone call. It was Emily. "How are you doing?" Margaret glanced toward the living room. Richard was asleep in his chair. The television played softly in the background. The volume was too loud. It always was now. "We're okay." Emily knew that meant they weren't, but she also knew better than to challenge it. After a pause, Emily asked, "How many boxes do you have left?" Silence. Then, "One." Neither woman spoke for several seconds. because they both understood the weight of that number. 1, not 10, not 5. 1. The end of the search, the end of the ritual, the end of the possibility. That Saturday evening, something unusual happened. Richard woke from a nap, looked around, then walked into the kitchen. Margaret was washing dishes. She heard footsteps behind her. Margaret? She froze. Not because he said her name. That still happened occasionally. It was the way he said it, clear, certain, familiar, like before, like years before. She slowly turned around. Richard was looking directly at her, really looking, not through her, not around her, at her. For the first time in months, Margaret's hands began trembling. Richard, he smiled. The same smile from the photograph, the same smile from the pickup truck, the same smile that had survived 40 years. There you are. The words nearly destroyed her, because for months he had been lost. And now, somehow, for a moment, he was home. They sat together at the kitchen table, talking, really talking. Not perfectly, not continuously, but enough. More than enough. Richard remembered their daughter, their first apartment, the old truck, their honeymoon, the dog they once owned, stories Margaret hadn't heard in years, stories she feared were gone forever. Then Richard noticed the blue box on the counter, the final box. He smiled immediately. Butterscotch. Margaret looked at it, then at him. And suddenly she knew. The waiting was over. She opened the box, slowly, carefully, almost ceremonially. The smell filled the kitchen, sweet, familiar, simple. Richard laughed softly. I haven't had these in forever. Margaret nearly cried hearing him say it, because for once, he sounded like himself. They shared the cookies together, like they had 40 years ago. No truck this time, no sunset, just a kitchen, 2 old chairs, and time that suddenly felt precious. At one point, Richard looked at her, really looked, then reached across the table, took her hand and said, "You've taken good care of me." Margaret felt tears filling her eyes. Richard smiled. "You always do." The room became very quiet, because somewhere deep inside her, she knew this moment was different. Then Richard asked a question, a simple question, the kind couples ask every day, the kind most people never realize they'll someday miss. He asked, "How long have we been married now?" Margaret laughed through tears. 38 years. Richard whistled softly. That's a long time. It is. He squeezed her hand, then smiled. Still not long enough. Margaret broke, completely, because that was exactly the sort of thing he used to say, years ago, before Alzheimer's, before hospitals, before fear, before forgetting. That night they sat together until nearly midnight, talking to remembering, confused. "I can't take this," Margaret smiled. "Yes, you can." Inside the cover was a note, written in Margaret's handwriting. It read, "Some people save lives, others save moments. You helped me save both." Emily looked up, tears immediately filling her eyes. Months later, aisle 7 looked ordinary again. The cookies were gone. The shelf had been replaced by another product. Customers came and went. Life moved forward, as it always does. But every Thursday evening, at exactly 6:17 p.m., Emily would glance toward the entrance, almost expecting to see Margaret walk through the doors. Old cardigan, leather purse, notebook in hand, searching for one more memory, one more moment, one more chance. And every time she thought about Richard, she remembered something. The cookies were never magic. The notebook was never magic. The store wasn't magic. The miracle had always been much simpler. A man spent his life loving a woman, and even when almost everything else disappeared, some small part of him kept trying to find his way back to her. And in the end, he did. The end.